Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Jim Hayes. Jim Hayes represents the 148th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes parts of the counties of both Erie and Niagara. That includes Amherst in Erie County, as well as Pendleton and Martinsville in Niagara County. And we want to thank you folks all across Western New York for tuning in for our show today. Jim Hayes, it's nice to see you.
So great to be here, Mike.
And we talked in our last program about the passage of the state budget, its impact on Western New York and the people that you represent. We're going to continue that discussion just a little bit today. But we start off this show with what was a really nice moment, I think, for the entire membership of the New York State Assembly, and especially yourself. You got to introduce some constituents from back home to the body as a whole, not just any constituents, though, a pretty special group of young ladies.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be able to introduce people from back home who come to visit the Capitol, introduce them to either the members of the State Assembly or to have them tour and see the seat of state government. But this particular visit was great because it was the Class A State Division champs, the Lady Spartans field hockey team from Williamsville North High School. Now, I have a daughter who's a freshman at Williamsville North, and I have a daughter who is in 8th grade who will be going to Williamsville North next year. So to welcome these Lady Spartan champions, state champions, to the chamber and introduce them to my colleagues was a great honor.
You know, it is not everyone who gets to go through life with state champion next to their name. So it is a pretty special time all the way around. Let's take a look at that introduction now, and then we'll be back to talk more about that other important stuff that we've got to talk about today here on Assembly Calendar.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, it is with great pleasure today that I introduce to you the 2010 New York State Class A Championship Field Hockey Team, the Williamsville North Lady Spartans. The Williamsville School District is the largest suburban district in Western New York, with over 10,000 students in 13 schools, 3 of which are high schools. And the Lady Spartans field hockey team, who are here today, finished their season undefeated with an outstanding 21-0 record. 18 of those wins were shutouts. But most importantly, on November 20th, the Lady Spartans captured the Class A Field Hockey Championship with a 1-0 victory over Mamaroneck. Mr. Latimer, where are you? It was their second New York State title in 4 years, previously winning the championship in 2007. And in addition to winning 2 New York State championships in the past 4 years, the team has vied for the state title 6 times in the last 8 years. They have won 8 section titles, 9 division titles, and 9 league titles since 1999. Mr. Speaker, if you would please extend to these very distinguished athletes and students the welcome of the Chamber and all of the cordialities of the House.
Gladly, Mr. Hayes. It's always, as you know, Mr. Hayes, it's always a pleasure to have champions come to see us, champions to visit us, and particularly young champions. I think that's always great. And this group here is not only champions, they're a powerhouse. They have proven that they're a powerhouse year after year after year. It's nice that they go back to more than 10 years, proving that they are truly worthy of being champions throughout the state of New York and throughout the nation. So on behalf of Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the Speaker, on behalf of all our colleagues, welcome to the floor. Enjoy the privileges of the floor. Come back real soon, and you have one more championship to go next year. Thank you for being with us here today.
Just so proud of them, and they toured the Capitol. We gave them a pizza party lunch because they came down in the morning and they went back after that, and just so proud of our young people. And we don't take enough time, I think, to really celebrate the accomplishments of young people today. We hear about the bad news and about the things that go wrong. This was a real opportunity to share some good news, and I'm sure the ladies really enjoyed it. They told me they did, and I enjoyed introducing them.
That sounds like it was a really long day. That's not one of those quick car rides back and forth from Williamsville to Albany. But I'll bet you it was worth it for them. And, we say this all the time. If you ever get the chance to come to Albany, you should see the state capitol. It is one impressive building.
It is, and it was also nice to give my colleague, Assemblyman George Latimer, a shot because he represents the Mamaroneck School District, who were defeated 1-0 by our Williamsville Lady Spartans. So all a great day.
Whenever you can get those little extra shots into the colleagues, that helps out a little bit too. Well, anyway, we're here to let you folks know about what important discussions are taking place at the state capitol and their impact on you. As I mentioned earlier on, the passage of the state budget, of course, we're going to be talking about this for quite a while. There's a lot of impacts of this budget on you folks in Western New York and all across New York State. You stood up and led the floor debate on behalf of the Assembly's Republican Conference. A good portion of that was, this year there were some things that you said in agreement with this budget, because this was a budget that was put together by the Assembly and the Senate and the Governor's office, and some good mutual agreements. But you also have some problems with, for example, the debt service portion of it. The debt of this state over the last 10, 20 years has been increasing. There was very little new debt in the current year's spending plan, but that doesn't mean you can ignore the old.
That's right. We got up and spoke in favor. I spoke in favor of Governor Cuomo's budget proposal and the final budget that was negotiated in open by the conference committees in both the Senate and the Assembly. I voted in favor of the budget this year for the first time in many years because the budget spent less money for the first time in 15 years. So for the first time since I've been in the State Assembly, we had a budget that actually spent less money than the year before. It closed a $10 billion deficit with no new taxes and no new debt. But you're right, in spite of the fact that that was achieved this year and it was a good starting point, but there's so much more work that has to be done, we have to really focus now on the tremendous debt that New York State has. Probably per capita one of the largest debts of any state in the country. And I called attention to this on the floor because I think people understand that years of overspending by the legislature and pushing things on the state credit card that taxpayers are burdened with the payments of. Every year we have to authorize that payment. It's like paying the credit card bill when it comes due. We've got to pay that down. We've got to stop putting debt on top of other debt over the years if we're ever going to restore New York State to fiscal balance going forward. So I think what we're going to look at is me highlighting my opposition to the state debt.
We compare the state budget process all the time to a household budget. I think it's a pretty fair comparison. And anybody in a household who has ever overextended just a little bit with credit and debt knows what we're talking about here. This is something that really the state's facing a huge mountain to try to turn that around and start heading in the other direction. Let's take a look at some of what Jim Hayes had to say about the state's debt load, and then we'll be back to talk more on Assembly Calendar.
Madam Speaker, my colleagues, this bill that comes before the House today, this budget bill for state debt service, will appropriate $8.8 billion as the minimum annual payment on the state's credit card. So in the same way that families and businesses get their credit card statements, this is the credit card statement, the bill come due, for the massive explosion over the last several years and decade of state debt. That's money going to interest payments to bondholders. Not a dollar of that is going to education to help put a teacher in the classroom or save a teacher from being laid off. Not a dollar of that $8.8 billion in front of us today is going to health care, to help the old, the sick, or the infirm in our state. Not $1 of that $8.8 billion is going to fix a road or a bridge in this state or provide public protection, the critical services that state government is relied upon to provide to our citizens. And of that $56 billion debt, shockingly, in spite of the Constitution of this state, only $3 billion of the $56 billion has been approved by the voters of this state.
That's an amazing number. there are some of us who remember back to the mid-'80s, an Environmental Quality Bond Act, some Transportation Bond Acts. There really haven't been any of those that I can think of, to my memory, since then. And yet the state's been accumulating more and more debt. And there is something in the Constitution that does say any debt the state takes on is supposed to be approved by the voters, and that's just not the case anymore.
Well, it's not the case because legislative leaders have found a way to circumvent that constitutional requirement, and that is to use the unaccountable, unelected state authorities to do what we affectionately call backdoor borrowing. I say affectionately because it's a way to describe a terrible practice that goes on, so voters don't get a chance to really cast a vote yes or no about committing themselves to long-term payment of debt, principal and interest, but rather state leaders, in the dark of the night will pass a debt bill that will allow state authority, the power authority or the thruway authority, to actually be the ones that go out and float the bonds in the marketplace to borrow the money, and then the state is on the hook or obligated to kind of wash money back and forth to make those payments, because at the end of the day, the state, those loans are backed by the full faith and credit of the state government. So it's a travesty that voters have not been allowed to voice their opinion up or down on some of these huge borrowing projects over the years. It's a travesty that whenever you borrow, obviously you have to pay interest. If you're not paying as you go for the things you need, you have to pay interest. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't borrow money for long-term capital programs. That makes sense in the same way people should, and can borrow money for a long-term investment, for example, in a mortgage when they buy a house. But, it seems that the state has found ways to overspend and then roll whatever the deficits are or whatever they can't come up with to feed their spending onto the state credit card, and that just creates a huge amount of interest, as you heard me say, $8 billion. Some of that's principal payment, but most of it's interest going to bondholders. And when you're paying interest, all that money is just that. It's interest to the bondholder. It doesn't go to the services that New York State taxpayers need and look to the state to provide.
That's just horrible, and I would suspect there's an awful lot of people watching this program and across the rest of the state that don't know about that don't realize that the state is accumulating all this debt and that they've got no say in it, even though the Constitution says they're supposed to.
That's right. That's why we challenge the majority in debates like you just saw on the floor of the State Assembly. We try to educate people back home to let them know about this and demand that they have their representatives respond to that concern by putting a stop to that kind of practice. I'm happy to say it did not happen this year as part of the state budget. There was no new debt that was included. And I think that's a small step forward, but we've got to continue that effort moving forward, or we're just simply mortgaging our children and our grandchildren's future.
Time is away from us. We've got just about a minute left. Big news out of Albany this past week is that there's going to be what's known as a summit on the issue of UB 2020. I guess the governor is bringing together all of what he would call stakeholders.
Yes, this is good news. The governor's using his leadership to convene a panel of people to discuss the pros and the cons. Clearly, the governor is supporting this. The Western New York delegation on both sides of the aisle, both parties, the business community, the newspaper, the labor community back home are all supporting it. Western New York has never been so united on a state project or a piece of state legislation as they are for UB 2020. So I'm hoping the governor, in bringing the parties together, can get an amicable solution and get UB 2020 passed this year so that we can empower our state university to grow and to be of greater impact to the economy in Western New York.
What's the 10-second answer to why downstate legislators are so scared of this?
They want control. They want people to continue to come to the legislature. They want to control and micromanage everything that happens at the university. This would free the university without having to send more money. It would free the university to be able to go into public-private partnerships and to expand and be more fully participating in the economic life of Western New York.
That was closer to a 20-second answer. We're out of time. Jim Hayes, thanks for joining us. Thank you, folks, too. We'll see you soon for our next Assembly Calendar.